I just wanted to be here personally to welcome Dr. Helen Caldicott. I'm sorry I can't be there tonight. I am in Casablanca, so it's quite a distance. Just wanted to make sure people understand, the audience understands how delighted we are to have you on this campus, on our campus. And I am also wanted to make sure we say a thank you to Roberta and Mary for suggesting the name. And I also wanted to thank my colleague, George Young, for taking on this responsibility. You could not be in better hands. We are watching you from Casablanca, and George Young, go ahead with the introductions, and thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Anwar, and I hope you'll be able to stay tuned because I think we have a really good presentation coming up tonight. The single most articulate and passionate advocate of citizen action to remedy the nuclear and environmental crises, Dr. Helen Caldicott, has devoted the last 38 years to an international campaign to educate the public about the medical hazards of the nuclear age and the necessary changes in human behavior to stop environmental destruction. Dr. Caldicott received her medical degree from the University of Adelaide Medical School in 1961. She founded the Cystic Fibrosis Clinic in the Adelaide Children's Hospital in 1975, and subsequently was an instructor in pediatrics at Harvard Medical School and on the staff of the Children's Hospital Medical Center in Boston until 1980, when she resigned to work full-time on the prevention of nuclear war. Dr. Caldicott has received many prizes and awards for her work, including the Lannan Foundation's 2003 Prize for Cultural Freedom, 21 honorary doctorate degrees. She was personally nominated for a Nobel Prize by Linus Pauling, himself a Nobel laureate. The Smithsonian has named Dr. Caldicott as one of the most influential women of the 20th century. She has written for numerous publications and has authored 7 books, including Nuclear Madness, Missile Envy, If You Love This Planet, A Plea to Heal the Earth, updated in 2009, A Desperate Passion, an autobiography, The New Nuclear Danger, George Bush's Military-Industrial Complex, Nuclear Power is Not the Answer, War in Heaven, and the most recent, Loving This Planet, Leading Thinkers Talk About How to Make a Better World. Dr. Caldicott also has been the subject of several films, including 8 Minutes to Midnight, nominated for an Academy Award in 1981, If You Love This Planet, which won the Academy Award for Best Documentary in 1982, and Helen's War, Portrait of a Dissident, recipient of the Australian Film Institute Awards for Best Direction for Documentaries, 2004, and the Sydney Film Festival Dendy Award for Best Documentary in 2004. Dr. Caldicott currently divides her time between Australia and the US, where she lectures widely. She founded the US-based Nuclear Policy Research Institute, NPRI, which evolved into Beyond Nuclear. Currently, Dr. Caldicott is president of the Helen Caldicott Foundation, nuclearfreeplanet.org, an educational outreach project that informs people of the dangers of nuclear power and weapons. The mission of the foundation is education to action and the promotion of a nuclear energy and weapons-free, renewable energy powered world. Topic tonight, how to fix a threatened planet. Would you please join me in welcoming Dr. Helen Caldicott?
Thank you, George. Thank you, George. The title is a bit intimidating. I've never had a title like this before, but I do have solutions, but it will involve all of you or the solutions are not going to work. So I'm going to address 3 topics tonight, and I am a paediatrician and a physician, so What I'll be talking about tonight is global preventive medicine. The first topic is global warming. And you must all be aware of this because you had Hurricane Sandy. The sea levels are rising. I think you're aware of that in Maine. You live on the coast. You have probably read an awful lot about the scientists' predictions about what is happening to the planet. The skeptics are funded by Exxon et al. To the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars. They've set up think tanks in Washington, often funded by the same, often staffed by the same scientists, so they rotate, and they get on Fox News and the rest and say there's doubt about global warming. There's no doubt. It is actually a fact. The same technique was used with the tobacco companies, and I can't tell you how many years. When I started medicine in '56, we knew then that tobacco caused cancer, but they injected doubt into the debate. Well, we're not sure really if tobacco causes cancer. And it took us years and years and years to convince governments that tobacco causes cancer. Now in Australia, we have plain sort of olive, yucky green covers for the cigarettes. I think a packet of cigarettes costs $20. And on the packet are these revolting photographs of people dying of cancer, or lungs in bottles full of cancer, or fetuses born deformed or whatever. And it is turning off a fair number of people because they're realising that as they smoke, they're producing a death sentence for themselves, probably. The same needs to happen in America. The tobacco companies are extremely powerful, and they own a lot of food companies now. So the tobacco companies have moved into other areas to sell a lot of awful junk foods that are making people obese, particularly children, and that's a health hazard too. But global warming is upon us. I live in Australia to the south of Sydney. There was a day recently when it was 115 in the shade. I went to town and it was okay, and I did some shopping, and within an hour the temperature went up 12 degrees centigrade. I got home thinking I was okay, but when I got home my body temperature must have risen, and I had to take all my clothes off and lie on the floor naked for an hour and be covered with a wet towel to recover. Old people, and I'm nearly 75, are more vulnerable to heat and cold than younger people. But any hotter than that, people can't survive. This year, Australia broke almost all records for heat. We had the most ghastly bushfires, you call them wildfires, in Tasmania. Houses burnt, forests burnt, but more, the kangaroos burnt, and the wallabies, and the wombats, and the snakes, and all our beautiful species. They get incinerated as well. And I always think of the species as we have these terrible fires. People worry about their properties and their money, but I think mostly of the species that are being decimated, koalas and the like. Big fires in New South Wales, and then just after that we had the most enormous flooding in Queensland, and children were swept away in the floods and the cars swept away. We've never seen anything like this in Australia before, and that's just the beginning. I went to a conference in Freiburg, Germany last year, and the head of the National Energy Institute said that the temperatures at this rate we're going will be 6 degrees centigrade hotter by the end of the century. We will not survive those temperatures. Now, most of us will be dead, but these children here will not be. And I'm a paediatrician. And so because I took the Hippocratic Oath, basically all the world's children are my patients. The way you practice preventive medicine is through the political process. For instance, there was a cholera epidemic in London 2 centuries ago, and it was realised that there was a pump emitting water with cholera vibrio in it. And it took the doctors 6 months to convince the politicians to turn off the pump. Guess what? The cholera epidemic stopped. How did we eliminate smallpox from the world? By understanding what the smallpox virus was, producing an immunisation, and we have eradicated that disease in the world. In other words, it's us, the physicians, who have to teach the politicians, most of whom are medically and scientifically illiterate, what it means for disease to occur. Thank you. They are, including Obama, which makes me annoyed. There are very few scientists in Congress, and those who are don't necessarily follow the dictates of science, like honesty and the like. So things are really grim. Islands in the Pacific are being inundated with rising sea levels. We may have to import the people from those islands as they're drowning. We have refugees at the moment. Australia is very racist, had once a white Australia policy. We're very bad towards our Aborigines, worse than you are towards your Native American Indians. And we're turning away refugees, which violates the UN Code for refugee status. But we haven't seen anything yet. We'll be seeing millions of ecological refugees fleeing from Bangladesh, because as the sea levels rise and Bangladesh is on a delta, hundreds of millions of people live there, and they're going to try and escape. But as well as the sea level rises, there are catastrophic storms. And the catastrophic storms were like Hurricane Sandy, when there was a full moon, an extremely high king tide, and in came the storm. You saw what damage it did to you, and yet still the politicians in Washington seem immune to any understanding about what this all means scientifically. James Hansen, who's the father of global warming at NASA, has just resigned to lead protests, and he talked about global warming years ago. In fact, when I wrote the first edition of this book, If You Love This Planet, this is a second edition, I wrote about global warming. That was 91, all predicted. And I thought, well, I've written the book, everyone will read it, and they'll fix it. Well, that's stupid. You know, it didn't work. The other thing medically is, as well as people drowning, as well as crops, as the temperatures rise, the forests have to move further north to be able to cope with the changed conditions. Already the bark beetle is destroying many of your conifer forests here and across Canada because it thrives in heat. And trees don't have time with the rapid increase of global warming to migrate. Now, and the other thing that's happening is the permafrost is melting. I went to Alaska years ago, and the lampposts and the telephone poles were sort of leaning at odd angles because the permafrost is melting. That's been there for millions of years. It has trapped millions of tons of CO2 and methane. Methane is 20 times more potent as a global heat trapper than CO2. It's already started to melt. And the Arctic ice is disappearing. And as the Arctic ice disappears, there's an albedo effect where instead of the ice being white and reflecting the heat back from the sun into the universe, it's black. And you know, black absorbs the heat. So it will propagate more heating. The Greenland ice cap has started to melt. West Antarctica, where I am, has started to melt as well. And there comes a point in a patient where you have them in the ICU, and you may have stabilised them. The heart functions okay, you've settled them down, the liver functions looking kind of normal, the kidneys are still not good, and they may get an infection. And you get what's called total organ collapse. The heart fails because of the infection, septicemia. The liver fails, and the kidneys fail, and the patient dies of total organ collapse. Now, the planet is like a patient. The integument or skin is the ozone layer. And in Australia, we have the highest incidence of skin cancer and melanoma in the world because the ozone's very thin in the southern hemisphere. And in the winter, the ozone is quite thick, but in the summer, the ozone migrates down to the South Pole. And we, although we're very racist and don't like Aborigines and people with dark skins, we like to get very tanned in the summer. And so we lie on the beach, especially the girls, sunbaked topless, to the delight of my young sons at the time. And there are dermatologists now patrolling the beaches, telling the kids to put their clothes on and sunscreen on. 1 in 9 Australians now get malignant melanoma. I've had one. It's a deadly, deadly cancer. As well as that happening, there will be droughts. Australia may not be a big food-producing country in the world, and certainly you won't be. Your corn crops and your wheat crops, you're already seeing that in the agricultural area. They're not producing the sort of grain that they once used to produce. And so the food-growing areas will move further north into Canada. As well as that, as the earth heats, we will start to see Anopheles mosquitoes migrating to Seattle, up here, and we'll get malaria, Eastern equine encephalitis, and many other diseases transmitted by arthropods, by insects, which are mostly only seen in the tropics now. Okay? So that's what our kids have to look forward to. And I see no evidence at all in this country of anyone doing a thing about it. Nobody, including Obama. Now, there is the XL pipeline where the coal tar sands in Canada are being mined. I've just been there, and they want to build modular nuclear reactors to power the extraction of the coal tar sands at a place called Peace River. The whole thing's psychotic. And normally, when you dig up coal or pump up oil, you get 13 to 15, what do they call it, barrels of oil from that. But with the coal tar sands, it's so energy using that you only get 5 barrels of oil equivalent. So what the hell do they think they're doing? Destroying their boreal forests, and the water has become extremely toxic, and the people downstream are getting cancers and dying and the like. What has happened in Washington, and we know this, you don't really have a democracy, you have an autocracy. It is run by the corporations totally. So for politicians here to get elected, they have to raise money. And who gives them the money? The oil companies, the nuclear companies, the chemical companies, the drug companies. So they are in fact corporate prostitutes. That's the truth, except Bernie Sanders. Is there anyone else who doesn't receive corporate money? And so when they get in, it's not you they represent, it's their corporate buddies who fund them. And then, of course, your terms are only 2 years long, so they're all the time spending their time raising more money. This is not a democracy. Furthermore, most people don't vote. How dare they not vote in a democracy? People are dying in other countries to have a democracy. And people are so lazy here, they don't get out. In Australia, voting is compulsory. We get fined $50 if we don't vote. Our campaigns are 3 weeks long, and we get funded by the federal government for our campaign expenses. I ran for the federal parliament in 91. I nearly won, lost by 600 votes out of 70,000. And all my expenses were paid by the federal government. That's called democracy. And you have the range, people with Down syndrome and the like, right up, and dementia, right up to, you know, Menses voting, and we're all very proud to vote. Why isn't your voting compulsory? The post office has all your addresses. People shouldn't have to register. You should be automatically registered. And everybody should vote. Now, if you don't all vote, what are you going to do? You know, you're responsible for your country, and yet because it's, you know, you're comfortable and you've got full bellies, and why should you bother? So the future is in great jeopardy, and I'm talking about our children because I'll be dead soon, and most of us will be. And people say to me, well, it's up to the children now to fix it. How dare we leave a traumatised world for our children to fix? And this has all happened in my lifetime. Global warming has happened in my lifetime. In Australia, we've got masses of coal, and we export it to China. I was in China in 67. No, 87. There wasn't a car in sight. We were on a bus, and the bus didn't even have its headlights on. And I said, why don't you turn the lights on? He said, I'd blind the cyclists. Millions and millions of bikes. And people sitting on the footpaths in Beijing, playing drafts, spitting out their watermelon pips, living where they always lived. And I wrote in this book, when I came back from China, once the Chinese get refrigerators and cars and the like, we've had it. Because who do they emulate? You. Why do they emulate you? Because you have Madison Avenue psychologists working out the best way to sell your rhubarb stuff. Like what's advertised on television. I mean, they even get into the most sort of private parts, like erectile dysfunction and hemorrhoid cream and all sorts of things they're advertising now. And then they say, when they advertise a pill, by the way, it's got this side effect. And people, I mean, they're probably going like this, like, should I take it or shouldn't I, because I might get so-and-so. It's really obscene. And the media, of course, is run by the advertisers because that's how they make their money. So I'm saying to you, you need a revolution. Now, how do you have a revolution in a country with full bellies and everyone comfortable? Well, do you love your kids? This is a university. This is to educate our children. And it's all very well and good to immunise our children, make sure they have good dental care, read them stories and fairy tales. I've got 2 little grandchildren now in Boston who I just adore. Get a good education. For what? Because they have no future. And you're burning coal like there's no tomorrow. In Australia, we're exporting uranium all over the world. The uranium in the Fukushima reactors was our uranium. We don't have nuclear power in Australia. It's too dangerous for us. We just export it so everyone else can have the benefits of the cancers and the like that will arise. So we're immoral. It's much worse than exporting heroin because heroin only affects the user. But nuclear power and the waste will affect all future generations for the rest of time, damaging the genes of all people and destroying the building blocks of life. So what I'm going to do now after that little lecture about global warming, the solution. Okay, so I commissioned a study a few years ago by a man called Arjun Makhijani, a physicist, and here it's called carbon-free, nuclear-free. There is enough renewable energy in this country to supply the whole country with renewable energy. There's enough wind west of the Mississippi to supply 3 times the electricity you currently use. Why isn't every building in America, why haven't they all got solar panels on them? Why is America so backward when it used to be so creative and have such initiative? What's the matter with this country? I've just been to Germany and Austria. There's solar panels on little farmhouses everywhere. You know, what's going on here? Well, the nuclear industry is against solar power and it's against wind power, and there are people called landscape guardians in Australia who are in fact funded by the British nuclear energy to tell people if they hear the windmills it's going to make them go a bit mad and funny sounds and they'll get sick, which is absolute rubbish. Medically, there is no justification for those claims. You need to upgrade the grid from the western states because most of the energy is used here on the east coast, but you could easily do that. America can do anything it wants. Just think, when Pearl Harbor was bombed, in 7 months, all your industries, auto and the like, were turned into weapons industries. In 7 months. Now, this situation is much more urgent and acute and critical than the war. Yet there's an antipathy or can't think of the word, where people are practicing psychic numbing. They don't want to see, they don't want to hear. Life's comfortable. We leave all our computers on at night. We leave our fridges on. We leave our stoves. The house is just a blinking range of lights at night. We think we can't exist without our computers. Well, we did well until computers were developed. Americans waste 28% of the electricity they use. Waste by leaving on lights. It's like when you go out to dinner here, you order a steak, you get a pound of steak, a huge potato and a loaf of bread. And you look at it and you think, my stomach can't fit that. It's almost nauseating. There's a sense of entitlement here that is not right for the rest of the world. And you export your propaganda via advertising to the rest of the world. And then everyone, and it's about coveting thy neighbour's goods. If I just had that, I'll live happily till I die. And you get it, and you're not happy anyway. And the only way you get happy is by serving others, by being a doctor and looking after patients. That's ultimate happiness, or helping to save the planet, or educating people, children, educating people. So no one here should use a clothes dryer. I'm going to have to strip. It's getting too hot. Clothes dryers are made by General Electric, who makes nuclear reactors and nuclear weapons. So Reagan used to be the big salesman for General Electric, electrified house. In Australia, I've never used a clothes dryer. We hang our clothes outside. There are laws in Atlanta to say you can't hang your clothes outside because Mrs. Brown next door might see your underpants or your brassiers. I mean, how ridiculous is that? Stupid. In the winter, hang them up in the basement beside your furnace and they dry in a flash. What's more, they tend to help humidification of the house. So think of how you use electricity when you walk through one of those doors. It's a global warming door or it's a carcinogenic door. And I'm getting onto nuclear power in a minute. Coal fire plants. You go into bathrooms and airports and I wash my hands. How do I dry them? There's a carcinogenic hand dryer or global warming hand. People don't walk. They're on the escalators. They're moving things all the time. I ask people where their electricity comes from. Where does yours come from? Where? No, that you're not. You're an exception to the rule. Where is your electricity here generated? So is it hydro? Yeah. Yeah, it's a mixture. But most people don't have any idea how they turn their lights on. And it's imperative that people understand that. But it's more imperative for people to open their eyes and understand the waste in this country. Nuclear power produces 20% of the electricity you use, so you don't need nuclear power if you save electricity, 28%. That's all in this book. It's not an advertisement, but read the book. Now, I have to take my coat off because I'm getting hot. There are five forms of radiation. There are X-rays, which are non-particulate forms of radiation. So when the doctor says, breathe in, hold it, or the technician runs out, hides behind a lead glass screen, and you go zap, that's the only instant where cells can be damaged, all right? X-rays are not good. Never have an unnecessary CT scan. All radiation is dangerous. There is no safe dose of radiation. Don't listen to the nuclear industry. No safe dose. We get a fair bit of background radiation. About 30% of cancers we see now are probably caused by background radiation from the sun and radon. You know about radon here in Maine, and the rocks on the earth and the like. Fluoroscopies, doctors who fluoroscope patients for putting in stents in their hearts and stuff. There's a new study to show that many of those cardiologists have brain tumours on that side of the head, which is next to the fluoroscopy thing. Patients get high doses. I had 2 CT scans recently ordered by my daughter, who's a doctor. And I had them, and I said, Penny, I got a huge dose of radiation. She said, don't worry, Mum, you won't live long enough to get your cancer, which made me feel really good. Daughters. Because it takes a long time to incubate cancer after you've been irradiated. People who have a lot of dental X-rays have shown recently to have a higher than normal rate of brain cancers. In other words, radiation is cumulative, and each dose you receive adds to your risk of getting cancer. Do never walk through those X-ray machines in the airport. I get whole body pat downs. I don't care what they feel. I don't care. I'm not going to go through those. But those X-ray machines, they're sending fetuses through. The nuclear industry uses a standard 26-year-old white 70-kilogram male to assess radiation exposure. But children are 20 times more sensitive to radiation than adults because their cells are rapidly dividing. Little girls twice as sensitive as little boys. Women twice as sensitive as men, and fetuses thousands of times more sensitive. 1 X-ray to the pregnant abdomen doubles the incidence of leukemia in the baby. That's why when you go to get an X-ray, they say, when was your last menstrual period? So they won't X-ray you in the second half of your cycle because you may have a little morula there that's going to develop into a fetus, which could be damaged. So I'm just warning you, don't ever have, and don't think doctors are gods. We play God. But if the doctor says, you need an X-ray, say why, and question him or her, and you have the ability to say no if you decide you don't want it. Now, the risk from an X-ray, say you coughed up some blood, is minimal compared to diagnosing your lung cancer and the like. Do you see? But we do too many unnecessary X-rays, and the radiologists are starting to write about it now, at last. My husband was my ex-husband was a radiologist. They make a lot of money, including dentists. Never have your teeth X-rayed every year. Hands up those who get their teeth X-rayed every year. Come on. I know what lots of you do. Every year at the dentist, You don't need it if you have a sore tooth or an abscess. You need an X-ray, but never get your teeth X-rayed every year. It's medically contraindicated. So there are X-rays. Then there's gamma radiation given off by radioactive elements, the same as X-rays. Non-particulate goes straight through you. There's alpha radiation, which is emitted from an unstable atom composed of 2 protons and 2 neutrons. It doesn't travel far. This alpha particle can be stopped by the dead layers of skin before it damages living cells or a piece of paper. But if you get it into your lung, say it's plutonium, and you breathe it in, here's your trachea and the bronchi, and it lands just here, just a millionth of a gram. Just a very small volume of cells are irradiated. Most die because the radiation is so high, but those on the periphery remain viable to become mutated and develop cancer. A millionth of a gram of plutonium will give you cancer. Each reactor makes 500 pounds of plutonium a year. You need 10 pounds to make a bomb, and its half-life is 24,400 years. Hands up those who know what a half-life is. Good. Okay, for those who don't, you start with a pound of plutonium. It decays so that in 24,400 years you have half a pound of radioactive plutonium. Another 24,000. Do you understand? And then there's beta radiation, which is an electron which travels further, that is emitted from an unstable atom. I could talk about neutrons, but I won't talk about neutrons now. Anyone wants to know during question time, I'll tell them. Now, how does radiation cause cancer? Our body is composed of trillions of cells, and each cell is a nucleus with the chromosomes. And to be simplistic, there's a gene which controls the rate of cell division called the regulatory gene. And if that gets hit by an X-ray, missed. By an alpha particle, got it. That if the cell doesn't die, the DNA molecule gets biochemically damaged. And that's called a mutation. And the cell will sit latent for any time from 5 to 80 years. And then one day, instead of dividing by mitosis in a regulated way, it goes crazy and produces trillions and trillions and trillions of cells. That's a cancer. So it takes a single alpha particle from uranium, radon, very carcinogenic and the like, to hit a single gene in a single cell to kill you. And it's silent and cryptogenic. You don't know you've had a mutation. And when you cough up your first blood or feel the lump in your breast, there's no sign saying, I was made by some radon you inhaled 20 years ago. The only way we know that radiation causes cancer, well, there's a huge literature on this. The old radiologists, many of them died of cancer because they used to test the X-ray beam by putting their hand under it. Madame Curie died of leukemia. She used to walk around with a piece of radium in her pocket and play with it. She loved it. Her bones were so full of radium. She was radioactive waste when she died. She actually died of aplastic anemia, which is when the bone marrow just stops producing any cells at all. Her daughter died of leukemia. I could go on and on. Then there are the Japanese survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, huge database. So cancers, that's how cancer can be caused. Now, most cancers we can't cure. We can cure quite a lot of childhood cancers now, but when you cure a childhood cancer like leukemia or a Wilms tumour in the kidney, often the radiation used to kill that cancer, why do we use radiation for cancer therapy? Because the cancer cells are so rapidly dividing, they're vulnerable to being killed by a high dose. But sometimes the normal cells around the cancer get mutated, and often, or some patients go on to get a second primary cancer later in life. Well, they've had a few years of life, and so that was good, but just be aware of what I'm talking about. Now, there are other cells in the body more important than normal body cells, and what are they? What? What? Brain? No. Yes, the sperm and the eggs. And they contain each half the number of genes as a normal cell, so when they mate, they have a diploid number of genes, and we all carry several hundred genes for disease, like diabetes or cystic fibrosis or the like, but we don't know until we mate with someone with the same gene that we have a child with cystic fibrosis, which was my specialty, and there are about 2,600 such diseases. And these genes were caused by background radiation and evolution over time. I won't go into evolution. I assume you all understand the Darwinian theory of evolution and the like. But I've been walking around the world lecturing, and then I've just found out that I carry a gene for disease called hemochromatosis. My oldest son has just been diagnosed with hemochromatosis, which is an abnormality in iron metabolism. And he had an iron level, I think, of 860, normal is 50. And the iron collects in the liver, producing cirrhosis, and the heart producing cardiomyopathy. And he, luckily, we got it before he had damage, but he gets bled, like a litre or two every few weeks, to bring the iron level down. They can't use the blood because he lived in London during the period of AIDS and stuff, so they won't use his blood, which is a pity. It just goes down the drain. So that means my ex-husband and I both carry the gene. It's like genes for blue eyes. You have blue eyes if you have two blue-eyed genes. But if you have a brown-eyed gene, which is dominant, and a blue-eyed gene, you're going to have brown eyes, or two brown-eyed genes. So here's a test. So two parents had a baby, and they both had blue eyes, and they had a brown-eyed baby. How did that happen? Come on, you know. What is it? Say. No. No, neither of them had brown-eyed genes. They both had two blue-eyed genes because that's the only way you can have blue eyes. Come on. What? Yeah. So genetics can be very useful. So as we increase background radiation, we're going to be damaging genes, not just in the human species, but all species have genes. And there are 30 million other species that cohabit the planet with us. Okay, so let's talk about nuclear power. And I've just held a conference at the New York Academy of Medicine called The Medical and Ecological Consequences of Fukushima. So I'll go into that in a minute, but I'll just describe nuclear power. And I can't go through the whole fuel cycle like uranium mining. You know how they say nuclear power is sustainable and clean and green? It's a lie, because you've got to mine the uranium, millions of tons of it. In Australia, we've got 40% of the world's richest uranium. You should see the trucks. They're half the size of this room, pumping out CO2, and the bulldozers and the like. Then you have to crush the ore, and then you have to send it to Paducah, Kentucky, where it's turned into uranium hexafluoride, a gas, passed through hundreds of filters made of nickel. And so on one side stays 238, which is the larger atom, and 235 collects gradually, and that's the fissionable isotope. When you mine uranium, 0.7% is 235, that's all. 235, and that's the one you make bombs out of, and nuclear power, and it must be enriched to 3% for use in reactors. Above 50% you can make bombs, and that's why they're worried about Iran. But any country can have an enrichment plant because that's allowed under the Non-Proliferation Treaty. We promote nuclear power, but by the way, you mustn't make bombs when you get a reactor. So they're all making bombs because America and Russia own 97% of the nuclear weapons in the world. And they're absolute hypocrites, saying to Iran, you're not allowed to have any. Like, who does America think she is? Well, I guess you're the greatest country on earth, but you're not. What about Australia? We've got kangaroos. So you enrich this uranium. They use two 1,500 megawatt coal-fired plants to generate the electricity to enrich the uranium. Oh, but nuclear power doesn't produce any global warming. And this nickel becomes very radioactive, giving out gamma radiation. So they're going to recycle it in a bill called Below Regulatory Concern, BRC, and they're really pushing for this because nickel's valuable. And they're going to recycle it into children's teeth braces, hip replacements, belt buckles, jewellery, knives and forks and furniture. And only if a scrap metal dealer has a Geiger count do they know they're being inundated with radioactive waste. Beware. Beware of your government. And Obama's trying to lift the standards for what sort of radiation you can be exposed to now, nuclear waste and stuff. Beware. Okay, so you take the uranium is made into little pellets like pieces of chalk, packed in a zirconium fuel rod, and they pack it 100 tonnes of uranium in the reactor core. It's submerged in water. You pull out the boron control rods. The neutrons start going crazy, like E equals mc squared, and you produce a hell of a lot of energy and heat. The heat boils the water. The water's turned to steam, which turns the turbine, which generates electricity. So all a nuclear power plant is designed to do is to boil water. It's like cutting a pound of butter with a chainsaw. And Einstein said nuclear power's a hell of a way to boil water. Well, you know, he was always right. He wished he'd been a farmer at the end of his life because of what this means. So the uranium becomes 1 billion times more radioactive as it fissions because 200 new elements are made, all of which are man-made, and they're terribly toxic. Some last seconds and some last millions of years. So you've got a radioactive, incredibly hot core. Each reactor uses 1 million gallons a minute of cooling water from a lake or a sea or a river, and it goes back relatively radioactive. So you're drinking radioactive water. A reactor can't operate without continuously releasing radioactive elements like tritium and xenon, argon, krypton, and the like. You'd better read my book called Nuclear Power is Not the Answer. Oh, I think I've got a bit of it in here. So Germany has done a study, and so has France, showing that children under the age of 5 living about 2 miles from a reactor have double the incidence of leukemia because of this, and a high incidence of solid cancers. And the nuclear industry says it's safe, don't worry, you know, and they say if there's an accident, we'll get you evacuated, you know. I mean, you don't even know there's an accident because they lie to you, like they did at 3 Mile Island and at Chernobyl and at Fukushima. It's a huge cover-up at Fukushima. Okay, so 100 tonnes of uranium, they take out 30 tonnes per year because it's so full of these fissionable isotopes. And they put them, often, this is Fukushima, in cooling pools on the roof of the reactor with a roof the same as a Kmart roof, a sort of tin roof. And these have to be continually cooled too, because if they're not continually cooled, they'll melt down. If you lose your cooling water here, 1 million gallons a minute, the reactor melts down. And it depends on an external electricity supply to keep the pumps running to run to cool the reactor. Well, what happened in Fukushima was, I'll get back to some radioactive elements in a minute, was the earthquake knocked out the supply. The earthquake also damaged the reactor, which the industry doesn't want to admit. And so they had underneath diesel generators the size of a house, which needed to be started, but in came the tsunami. And it destroyed, drowned the diesel generators. And within hours, 3 reactor cores began to melt down. 3. The Japanese government didn't tell the Japanese people for 3 months that there had been 3 meltdowns. And that's the sort of thing that happened with you at 3 Mile Island. The nuclear industry is really scary. And when I debate with them, they lie. When I debated with generals about nuclear war and the medical consequences, they couldn't sort of deny it. They knew. And they were more reasonable and more gentlemanly-like than nuclear power people. I don't know what the psychological impetus is that these men have, but they're really rude, many of them, and they attack me personally when they can't answer my logic, you know. Well, they do that with women quite often anyway. So what happened was at Fukushima, the 3 reactors melted down, and then what happened was zirconium cladding at high temperature, I think it's 1,500 degrees centigrade or Fahrenheit, I can't remember, the zirconium reacts with water producing hydrogen. Now these old reactors, like the one at Pilgrim, Plymouth in Massachusetts, they've got a relief valve to release the hydrogen, but they of course lost all the lights. The men didn't know where they were. It was dark, pitch dark. The radiation monitors were going off. And to open this valve, 2 men had to go down and manually turn a big wheel a lot of times to open the valve. Of course, it couldn't happen. So the hydrogen built up. Bang! There were 3, 4 hydrogen explosions. And actually, in reactor 3, there was one what's called excursion or kind of a nuclear explosion, which released a hell of a lot of radioactive material into the air. Now, for the first 3 days, most of the radiation went across the Pacific because the winds were blowing from west to east, dumping huge amounts in the Pacific. And huge amounts of radiation are still being released into the Pacific Ocean. Don't ever eat any Japanese food again. A lot of the Japanese landmass is contaminated. They're feeding children at school with radioactive rice. The government is supporting the Fukushima farmers to get them back on track again. The mushrooms are so radioactive they're banned. The wild boar are so radioactive they almost glow in the dark. The cattle contain radioactive silver. And what I want to show you now is the isotopes that are made, the elements made in a reactor, because you won't even know about this. So this is a 10-year-old CANDU reactor, a Canadian reactor, and I'm going to walk through. I said there are 200 elements. That doesn't have their half-life, so I don't know. I mean, I don't even know a lot of these elements. Most have never been analysed to see where they go in the food chain and in the human body. Okay, so hydrogen, that's tritium, H3. That is a beta emitter, and it's very carcinogenic. It is absorbed through the skin, through the lung and the GI tract, and it causes cancer in any organ. It actually combines in the DNA molecule, which contains hydrogen, so it's very mutagenic. Beryllium, I don't know where that goes in the body. Carbon-14 has a long half-life of, I think, about 1,500 years. So it's around, and carbon-14 goes into the gene because we're made of carbon. Silicon-32, which is pretty radioactive. Phosphorus-32, which is used in labs. Sulfur, chlorine, argon. I'm just going to walk you through these quite quickly. Potassium, to give you an idea of what we're talking about. Potassium, 4042. Calcium, 2 isotopes. Scandium, vanadium, manganese, iron, 2 isotopes, cobalt. Cobalt-60 is a very nasty isotope, very radioactive. Oh, shucks, right down. Okay, so we're going down now. Vanadium, manganese, iron, cobalt, nickel, zinc, selenium, krypton, rubidium, strontium, which causes bone cancer and leukemia. Yttrium, I don't know where that goes. I think it goes to bone. Zirconium, I don't know where that goes. Niobium, there are 5 niobium isotopes. Don't know where they go. Molybdenum, technetium has a very long half-life and is very dangerous. Ruthenium, rhodium, palladium, silver. There are 5 isotopes of silver, and one of them is being found in the cattle in the meat in Japan. Cadmium, indium, tin, 6 isotopes, 7 isotopes of tin, antimony, tellurium, iodine, 129, that has a half-life of 17 million years, causes thyroid cancer. Cesium-134 and 137, that's what they're measuring now in Europe after Chernobyl and in Japan. Cesium-134 has a half-life of 2.5 years. Cesium-137, a half-life of 30 years, so it's around for about 600 years. And it's on the ground continually being concentrated in the food chain by orders of magnitude at each step. Barium, lanthanum, cerium, praseodymium, neodymium, I can't pronounce it, promethium, samarium, europium. Come on. Down you go, stop scrolling. Gadolinium, terbium, dysprosium. I mean, the physicists have all analysed these. Holmium, thulium, lutetium, hafnium, tantalum, tungsten. I mean, you can just see on and on. Platinum, thallium, lead, lots of isotopes of lead. Bismuth, polonium, that's what killed that man Litvinenko in England when someone dropped a drop of polonium in his tea and he died of acute radiation illness in 2 weeks with his hair falling out, vomiting and bleeding to death because high doses of radiation kill the actively dividing cells of the body, the hair. That's why patients who have radiation therapy lose their hair, gut, so you get awful nausea, vomiting, and the blood cells, so you die of bleeding and infection because the white blood cells are killed and so are the platelets. Radon, you know about that here. Francium, radium, which killed Madame Curie, actinium. We used to use radium to treat cancers and stuff, and those people, a lot of them got cancers. Thorium, proctinium, uranium, lots of them, neptunium. These are all alpha emitters now. Dangerous as hell, I mean, incredibly mutagenic. Alpha particles, americium, named after America. Oops. Somehow I can't scroll. What's happening? Why doesn't it scroll? Americium, curium, these are all alpha emitters, nasty things. Berkelium, californium, and that's it. Did any of you have any idea that all of this was in a nuclear reactor? You don't get told, do you? The physicists keep it under their hats or wherever they keep it, and so do the nuclear engineers. So let's go on to look at Japan now. So this is where the radiation went. The very high amounts went up to the northwest when the wind changed, and the government they knew where the radiation was going because they have a system called SPEEDY where they measure the radiation. They didn't tell the people, and people fled into the path of the highest radiation because they didn't want to create panic. So they lied to the people. This whole area is incredibly radioactive, and down here is Tokyo. I've just been to Tokyo. There are areas in Tokyo, quite large areas, the dust in the apartments, the moss on the roof, the dirt in the streets is so radioactive and got americium and all sorts of stuff in it. Here it would be sent to radioactive waste dump. It's so radioactive. 35 million people live in Tokyo. I wore a mask at all times. The Japanese sleep on their floors, and the dust on the floors is radioactive, and of course people walk in and out, although they do take their shoes off. This area is Fukushima, where much of the rice in Japan is grown, mushrooms, spinach, the milk, the meat, lots of it is radioactive, and it's now being fed to children, and you don't know, because you can't taste radiation in the food because the sensors don't pick it up, whether you're eating radioactive food or not. In fact, more of Japan was contaminated, and it will be contaminated for hundreds of years. That's why you must never eat miso, seaweed, fish, or anything from Japan, ever again. Okay? I know Japanese food's lovely. Okay, so the next one is this one. So this is hard to see, but this is Europe. Here's Chernobyl, and there's the reactor, like it's not there. And there was a man called a hydroelectric specialist in charge of Chernobyl in the middle of the night, and he did a crazy experiment. I think he removed the control rods too fast. And there was a massive explosion, and the control room filled up with white dust, and he said to his two underlings, go and see what's happened. And they came back and they said, it's gone. And he said, what? They said, the reactor's gone. He said, don't be ridiculous. Go and have a look again. The reactor's gone. And because the control rods were made of graphite, like pencils, lead in pencils, it burnt tremendously for 10 days, and the radiation went all over Europe. It was first picked up in Sweden. Children who were in utero at the time have lower than normal IQs because the developing brain is very sensitive to radiation. There are farms growing lambs here that have to be closed down forever because the lambs are full of cesium. And this is only a map of cesium, not all the other elements that escaped, all of them. You know, all the alpha emitters and everything. Turkey's very radioactive. Turks picked all their radioactive tea and sent it back to Russia because they were so cross with the Russians. So I don't eat any food in Europe from Europe at all. I look at all the labels to see where the food comes from. I do not eat European food. I asked the man in Melbourne, Australia, how does he test the food being imported from Europe? He said, oh, we do random spot checks. And I said, how do you do that? And he said, well, the computer picks out certain batches to test. And I said, what do you do when you find radioactive food? He said, oh, we dilute it with non-radioactive food. The solution to pollution by dilution is fallacious when it comes to radiation because it reconcentrates back in the human body. And so when it lands on the soil, the grass and the vegetables concentrated by orders of magnitude, and then the cattle eat the grass, concentrates by orders of magnitude in the cow's milk and the meat. Then a pregnant woman drinks the milk, or a lactating woman, the baby's drinking radioactive milk. and also as the radiation passes through her breast, genes may be mutated and later she'll develop breast cancer. Do you see how it goes? And so right up the food chain, and the fish particularly concentrate radiation. Don't eat fish. Well, you know, the radiation from Fukushima is heading your way in the Pacific. The most radiation ever in history has been released into the Pacific. And I live on the Pacific too. So Europe is just, and there's been a book put out by the New York Academy of Sciences to show that over 1 million people have already died as a result of Chernobyl. Epidemics of thyroid cancer, other cancers, diabetes, premature aging in children, cataracts, homes full of the most deformed babies and children that we've ever seen in the history of pediatrics all around Chernobyl. I mean, reading that book is just like reading a science fiction horror story for a doctor. Now you translocate this to Japan, and we're back, you know, 1 million people already have died in the first 26 years. So Japan is only 2 years old. We're now finding they've tested 140,000 children in Fukushima Prefecture by doing thyroid ultrasounds. Over 40% have lesions in their thyroid, cysts, nodules. 3 have developed thyroid cancer. We didn't see thyroid cancer in Chernobyl for 5 years. So this is really early, indicating they've got a hell of a dose of radioactive iodine that goes only to the thyroid gland. And 7 more are suspected of having thyroid cancer. That's the tip of the iceberg, meaning they've got a huge dose, not just of I-131 and I-129, but all the other isotopes in their food and in their lung by inhalation. So we're sitting on a potential epidemic of cancer and the likes of which, well, we've seen it in Europe now, but we'll see in Japan. And they're covering up the data. They're not telling their parents what they're seeing in the ultrasounds. The parents are desperate. I've just been to Japan. I had 500 parents in the audience. I'd give them a medical lecture, and then it became a medical consultation. Does radiation get excreted in breast milk? My child's got diarrhea. What does that mean? And it was just so sad, and they were so grateful that I, as a doctor, came to tell them the truth. So the Japanese government is covering it up. The Japanese government is like that with TEPCO, Tokyo Electric Power Company. Now, what else is happening in Fukushima is this, that, I need to talk about, well, I've kind of talked about it. I've talked about I-131, which causes thyroid cancer. Its half-life is 8 days, so it's gone in 10 weeks. But it's very carcinogenic. It's a beta and a gamma emitter. You know, like those X-rays? Cesium-137, I've talked about, half-life 30 years. It's around for 600 years. It's a beta and gamma, very, very carcinogenic. Strontium-90, which causes bone cancer and leukemia because it goes to bone. It lasts for 600 years too, and that's also a beta and a gamma. And then there's plutonium that's handled like iron by the body. So it gets transported and stored in the liver where it causes liver cancer, to the lung where it causes lung cancer. It's transferred by macrophages to the lymph glands here where it can cause leukemia. It goes to the bone where it can cause bone cancer and leukemia. It crosses the placenta into the developing embryo, and the placenta lets few things pass, but plutonium gets in where it's going to cause deformities, like it will kill a cell that's going to form the left half of the brain or the right arm, like that drug thalidomide that pregnant women took for pregnancy and their babies were grossly deformed. That's called teratogenesis, damage of a genetically, chromosomally normal fetus. That's why we've got homes full of the most deformed infants around Chernobyl now. People don't understand this. I was interviewed by George Monbiot from The Guardian. He said, well, nobody's died. He doesn't understand it takes a while for people to develop these illnesses, a latent period of carcinogenesis, which is why I held a symposium to try and teach the media what the medical implications of radiation are about. Plutonium also has a predilection for testicles, and it concentrates next to the precursors of the sperm, where it's going to radiate the sperm, and the damaged genes get passed on generation to generation. And if the man gets cremated out, the chimney goes plutonium, so another man can breathe it in. So you can see it goes on for the rest of time. Every male in the Northern Hemisphere has a tiny load of plutonium in his testicles. Now, from weapons testing days, where the military and the physicists knowingly, totally covered the whole of the Northern Hemisphere with radioactive fallout. And many of the cancers we're seeing now almost certainly are related to that wicked, wicked testing where they blew up over 1,000 bombs in the atmosphere, releasing huge amounts of radiation. That's another story. So the problem with Fukushima now is that there are 3 meltdowns. Hydrogen is still collecting in each of the reactors, so they're having to inject nitrogen in to dilute the hydrogen so there won't be any more hydrogen explosions. They don't know how to get rid of these melted cores. They're called corium because they melted through 6 inches of steel onto the containment floor. And they're still producing hydrogen. It's going to go on for, I don't know. They've never had a situation like this. 40 years? They'll never get in to clean it up. It's so radioactive. And then nobody can. They sent a computer in there, a robot there the other day, and it died because it's so radioactive in that area. Then Building 4, they'd just taken out all the spent fuel at Building 4 just before the earthquake, serendipitously, and they put it on the roof of the reactor in the cooling pool. So here's the Building 4, damaged terribly by the earthquake. Its walls are sort of going like that. Here's the cooling pool containing about 150 tonnes of the most radioactive material you can imagine because it's fresh from the reactor. If there's an earthquake greater than 7 on the Richter scale, it's predicted the building will collapse, and they're keeping cooling water going. The pool will fall, there'll be no more water, and the thing will burn, releasing 10 times more radiation than was released at Chernobyl. The Japanese politicians are talking about evacuating Tokyo, 35 million people should that occur. It's going to take them 2 years to reinforce the building enough to put a huge crane up here to lift the fuel rods out by remote control and put them in, I don't know, dry car. I don't know what they're going to do with them. Meanwhile, the whole Northern Hemisphere is threatened by this, 10 times more than at Chernobyl. My kids live in Boston. I'm going to get them out and send them to Australia because the 2 air masses don't mix at the equator. So you're the ones who are going to get it. The international community is saying nothing about it. You all should be in there helping them, you know. This is a global catastrophe. But so we're sitting on this just waiting for it to happen. And every day there are more earthquakes there, little ones. But, you know, get a big one, Bob's your uncle. That's what we say in Australia when something's inevitable. So that's Fukushima. Now, okay, so you've got 104 reactors in your country. I think they closed one down the other day. 23 are of the Fukushima design. So what are you going to do about them? Come on. What? Close it? No, not just Vermont, Yankee, all of them. They are medically so dangerous because you could have an accident. I read the report, independent report commissioned by the Japanese Parliament, collusion, corruption, the like, and I thought this could apply just as easily to America. The NRC, Nuclear Regulatory Commission, comes from the nuclear industry. It's the fox guarding the chicken coop. It's the Dracula guarding the blood bank. You're being lied to consistently. You could easily have an accident like this with global warming, the ocean levels rising, catastrophic storms. All the reactors on the East Coast were closed down with Hurricane Sandy. So it floods a control room, bang, you've got a meltdown. The rivers levels are falling because of droughts. There's not enough water to cool them. The river temperatures are going up. It's not cool enough to cool the reactors. Human catastrophes, hurricanes where you lose your external electricity supply. What about a big solar flare? It'll knock out all your electricity supply in America. How many meltdowns will you have then? And they're predicting a solar flare quite soon. I don't know how to mobilise Americans because I sort of say this, and I know some of you have got horror written on your faces, but others are sort of, well, what can I do? And people say, well, what can I do? Like, open your mouth, baby. Here's your pap. I'll feed you. You know, no one has ever told me what to do because I know medically what this means. And what I haven't finished with is radioactive waste. You have here 69,000 tonnes of incredibly radioactive waste from your civilian reactors, and about the same from all the bombs you've made at Hanford and Savannah River. There's nowhere to put it. They were going to put it in Yucca Mountain, which is made of pumice. Do you know what pumice is? It's the stuff Mum used to use it to get the nicotine stains off her hands when she smoked. But it's dust from volcanoes. They wanted to put it there, over an aquifer that supplies Las Vegas. So Harry Reid, he comes from Nevada, and Harry Reid said, no way. So you've got nowhere to put your radioactive waste, and the EPA says it must be stored isolated from the environment for 1 million years. And I've been saying to the nuclear industry forever, what are you going to do with the waste? And they say, don't worry, we're scientists, we'll work it out. And that's like me saying to a patient, you've got pancreatic carcinoma, you'll probably die in 6 months, but don't worry, I'm a good doctor. In 20 years, I'll find the cure. This is the legacy we leave to our descendants, these kids, when we're all dead, so we can turn on our lights. Think, Mozart didn't have electricity. Shakespeare wrote by candlelight. We existed for millions of years without electricity. Oh, but we have to have it, yeah, I suppose we do, but we can generate it with renewables without this. What do we do with this waste? Well, no container lasts longer than 100 years. Cement, metal or anything. It'll leak. It'll get into the underground water supplies and then it'll get up into the food chain. It's concentrating by orders of magnitude in the grass, the milk, the meat, and then in humans. And you can imagine generations hence, people waking up, their babies already being born deformed, the breast milk already radioactive, children getting cancer at the age of 6 instead of 60 because they're exposed to radiation in utero. That's for the rest of time. This is a scenario that is absolutely horrendous from a medical perspective. And the medical dictum says if you have an incurable disease, you must prevent it. Most cancers are incurable, we must prevent it. What to do with that? I don't know. Nobody knows. It's a wonderful film called Eternity, made by Michael Masden, who's Danish, I think. And Finland's building a deep pit into a granite thing to put the radioactive waste in, but it won't do any good over time. It's the most profound philosophical film I've ever seen. And I interviewed him on my radio program, Infinity. And the Department of Energy is employing anthropologists to work out what signs to put on radioactive waste dumps. So, people generations hence. Jesus didn't even speak English, and he only lived 2,000 years ago. I mean, we're mad. We are nuts. And the people involved in the nuclear industry are sociopaths. And someone said to me the other day, in Germany, they used to say, Daddy, what did you do during the war? Did you transport the Jews to the gas ovens? Well, in time, kids are going to say, Daddy, why did you build those reactors? Then, so what do? We close the bloody things down. I'm Australian, so I'm allowed to say bloody because we swear. It's how we talk. That's not a knife. This is a knife. Did you see the film? What was it called? Crocodile Dundee. Yeah, Crocodile Dundee. So they have to be shut down. Now, I know you've got laws and everything. All your laws protect the corporations. They don't protect you at all. Now, laws are written to protect the majority of people. And if they do not, they must be changed. No laws are written in stone. And the lawyers grease the wheels, of course, all the time. You've got to work out how to get on television, put doctors on television. Here's one. Former head of the AMA. I went like this. Get on television and explain to people medically what it means. So Mrs. Joe Sixpack out there with all her kids, she knows. And that's what we did during the nuclear weapons freeze. When I came here in 78, almost every American said to me, well, it's better to be dead than red. And I said, what? Yeah, we don't want to be communists. I mean, it was a psychotic nation. And I said, what, you'd rather be blown up in a nuclear war? Yeah. So I organised 23,000 doctors and we started telling people what happens if a bomb drops on Boston. Like out to 5 miles, everyone's vaporised. It comes in at 20 times the speed of sound. half an hour from Russia to you, or vice versa. So you've got 1,000 weapons targeting Russia now and 1,000 targeting on Russia's side you. There are 10 H-bombs right now targeted on New York, 16 on Washington, D.C., same in Moscow. And they talk about terrorists. Who are the real terrorists in the world? They're mad, these people. And America and Russia are now best friends. We trade. They're capitalists, you know. Well, we believe in capitalism, do we? I don't. But anyway, because Jesus was a socialist. Leave everything and follow me, you know. So anyway, why are they still planning to blow each other up? Well, that's why I call my book Missile Envy, a la Freud. Because there's a deep psychological significance in these, those girls know, in these weapons. You know, if you watch a missile come up with huge big balls of fire at the bottom, you know, it just looks like that. And an anthropologist interviewed the weapons makers, and the man who designs the bomb sleeps with the bomb in the desert alone the night before the test. And he talks about labour pains. He talks about needing to push. And after the bomb explodes, he talks about postnatal depression. So he's comparing annihilation to birth. You know, and this is very fascinating to me from a psychological point of view, because the cause of all of this is psychological. It's not the number of bombs, we can count them till the cows come home. What are the dynamics, mostly in the male brain, that stimulate this sort of aberrant, deviant thinking? So I want to write a book called Why Men Kill and Why Women Let Them. And it's generic, you know, it's not applied to any man in the audience, but generally, why? And it involves Jungian archetypes and glorification of war. I mean, murder in this country is a criminal thing. You go to jail, you might get electrocuted in that electric chair, but your country's totally involved in killing. You spend $1 trillion a year on killing. $1 trillion. $1 trillion. And where does your money go? Lockheed Martin, Boeing, Raytheon. You have socialised killing and you have capitalistic medicine, where in Australia, medical care is free. Free. You go to hospital, you have the best orthopaedic surgeon in Sydney, anaesthetics, you stay in 6 days, free. That's called civilisation. That's what your country should be doing. Thou shalt not kill. Guns, I'll get onto that, yeah. Guns, in Australia we had a slaughter about 20 years ago. Young man went mad. They're all young men apparently, and they become psychotic. And I've seen patients become psychotic overnight. You can do background checks till the cows come home, but you can't predict what is going to happen to someone psychologically. And so the Prime Minister called for all guns in America to be taken to a central depot, and they were all chopped off and destroyed, all of them. And if you have a gun, you're a criminal and you go to jail. Now, why can't you do that here? Background checks, how ridiculous. You know, well, we'll have cartridges, you know, we had 10 weapons in an assault rifle, not 20. I mean, how sick is that? Guns kill people. And the NRA, they should be put in jail because they got blood all over them. Blood all over them. They're nuts. And it's time Americans rose up and said, we will not have guns anymore. Second Amendment is rhubarb, because it was developed, 300 years ago? A militia, your militia is the Pentagon. You've got a militia. What's more, it goes all over the world and kills people all over the world, you know, like 1 million people in Iraq, half of whom were children. So I could go on and on. But the threat of nuclear war is ever present every day and every night. And we've come close to nuclear war so many times with computer errors, or a flock of geese has set off the computer. Kids are hacking into the early warning system now. I don't honestly know how we're still here. And when I look at the data, as you do with a patient, and collect the history, and then you make a prognosis, I don't know how we're still here. So you can get rid of nuclear weapons, because Obama, I do think, wants to. He said, but I need your help because you can't do it alone. The Pentagon's very powerful and they're all into missile envy. It was funny when I wrote that book, the generals hated it, but on every bookshelf in the Pentagon, there was a copy of my book because they knew it to be true. So he needs your help. Russia's ready to abolish nuclear weapons. Yeah, what about Israel? Third largest arsenal in the world. That you don't have any moral authority unless you abolish nuclear weapons yourself, because you've led the arms race at every step of the way except one, and Russia's stupidly copied and followed. You know, now you're selling reactors to United Arab Emirates. They'll make bombs out of their plutonium. Why shouldn't they? See not the mote in the other person's eye. Look instead for the mote in your own eye. Develop humility. Not just humility, but responsibility to saving life on the planet. Because if there's a nuclear war and all the cities burn, a huge cloud of toxic black smoke will rise up in the stratosphere, circling the Earth with a cloud so thick it'll block out the sun for 10 years, inducing a short ice age, nuclear winter, and everything and everyone will die. That could happen tonight. So 3 cures. Renewable energy, you've got it within your power, do it. Stop spending money on those damn weapons. Transfer the money from the Pentagon to renewable energy, like now. 2, close down all your reactors. What you do with the waste, God only knows. And 3, abolish nuclear weapons. There's the way to fix a threatened planet. Thank you. Thank you very much. Yeah. Okay, I'll take a few questions. I've given you so much to think about. And I want just to tell you that if you've really taken it in, what I've said, you'll go through the Kubler-Ross stages of grief. One is shock and disbelief. Like, she said one wrong thing and I'll get a second opinion. And I won't believe her. Okay, the second one is depression. Feel it. Don't try and hide it. Don't take Zoloft or, antidepressants. Well, if you want a drink, you can have one. But stay with your feelings, because through that grief comes your answers. And the next stage is anger, railing against God or whoever. And it's during the angry phase that you have tremendous energy to focus on what you're going to do. And the answer will come to you from your own soul, not from me. Read all my books. Don't believe a word I've said. Check everything. Hugem, you can go to my website, helencaldicott.org, helenCaldicottFoundation.org, and you can download the symposium that I just held in New York. You just learn, educate yourselves. And Jefferson said, an informed democracy will behave in a responsible fashion. So it's the media determining the fate of the earth. And there's a question.
And we just ask people to speak into the microphone.
Yeah, I was just wondering, now that you scared the hell out of everybody in this room, or at least the people that don't know, and made the sleeping pill industry very happy, different therapies exist, I know of chelation and whatnot, different foods and herbs, substances and therapies that you can do to actually remove radiation from the body. I was just wondering if you could let us all know your expertise on that subject.
You can't. You can chelate plutonium with a substance called EDTA, but it only removes, I don't know, 60%, so you're still left with it. And furthermore, if you remove it, you're left with the damage that the plutonium has already done. You can't get any of the other elements out. Food, nutrition, whatever, will not remove radioactive isotopes from the body. To find out what you've got in your body, you have to get into a whole body counter. And they do a spectrum of gamma radiation to work out which elements are actually in the body. You don't need to, but people in Japan need that. But we can't do anything about it. See, that's the thing. People in America think, well, I've got a headache, I'll take whatever they take, I'm depressed, But there's nothing we can do. That's the message of this lecture. The only way to deal with it is prevention. Don't think about yourself. Close the reactors down. Get involved. And you'll be really happy doing it. Here's this one here.
Okay, so for the existing nuclear waste, I know this could be extremely expensive, but like in the future, could we possibly send it to space or something? I don't know.
Okay, that's a good question. They loaded 3 rockets up with, I think, plutonium in the 50s or 60s, and the risk of failure was 0. 2 failed to fire, and 1 exploded in the atmosphere, increasing the level of plutonium by a factor of 5. It's incredibly expensive anyway. No, that's not a solution. It would be good if we could. Send it all to the sun. Can't.
I believe it's true that after Fukushima, the German government decided to close down their nuclear reactors as soon as possible. Is that proceeding, and what are they replacing that energy with?
Yeah. Germany is leading the world in renewables, and they don't get a lot of sun, but solar panels still work on cloudy days. And I've just been in Germany, and solar panels are everywhere. 40% of their electricity is now generated with wind and solar. Angela Merkel is a physicist, and she was for nuclear power, but the Germans are well educated, and that started with my friend Petra Kelly, who started the Green Movement in Germany. The Germans know all about nuclear power. They won't allow it. Switzerland is going to close their reactors down. They had a referendum in Italy, and 80% of the Italians, I love the Italians. I mean, they don't fight when they're in a war. They put their hands up and surrender because they don't want to be killed, you know. So 80% voted to close down their reactors. England's a hell of a mess. France, 80% of her electricity comes from nuclear power. Don't eat French food either, or drink French wine, because every corner you turn there's a reactor with a huge cooling tower and a child with a bucket playing in the sand and a starfish. You know, it's just, the French are nuts. I've got a French son-in-law who's a count. They're a bit arrogant.
I would say that everything that you said resonated with me. So thank you for being out in front on these issues for as long as I can remember. I would have said that if I had a magic wand, the first change that I would make to life on planet Earth would be to diminish the number of humans by at least a factor of 10. And I would have said that that would have enormous effect on every single problem that you outlined for us here tonight. But you didn't mention human overpopulation, and I'm curious about why.
Well, I've got a chapter on it in this book. And the 80,000 toxic chemicals you live with every day is sure. 200 years ago, there were 1 billion of us. Now there are 7. Exponential population increase. We're crazy. And the religions that, you know, want people to reproduce like crazy, the Catholic Church, it's out to lunch. And the Muslims are out to lunch. They're out to lunch. And the religious Jews, I mean, what are they on about? Pie in the sky when you die? You know, it's just ridiculous. Now, if you educate women and provide them with contraceptives, they stop having babies. Well, they might have 2. That's what the World Health Organization, the UN, America should be doing right now to stop overpopulation. And, do you know, it's relatively easy. Well, in India they did vasectomies on the men, and the men didn't like that, but that's probably a good solution. I used to say we should put contraceptives in the water supply of the world and aphrodisiacs to keep everyone happy, and in 100 years we'd die out. That'd be good, and all the bears could come back into New York and the buildings would crumble. I mean, I think we're an evolutionary aberrant, actually. And I said to Carl Sagan once, do you think there's life in the other life? And he thought for a long time, and he said no. And I said, why? And he said, because if any species had developed to our stage of development, they would have destroyed themselves. So I know, I might just finish with this. I've delivered lots of babies. I love babies. And the purity that you see in these babies and kind of the wisdom, archetypal wisdom is there. Then they grow up and the hormones get going and they do all sorts of wicked things sometimes. Now, I've treated a lot of men on their deathbed or their children who are dying. And at that point, they open up and tell me everything they've done that has been bad and wicked, because they're at the coalface. And that's when I see that beauty and purity of the soul with which they were born open up again. It's there always. So what hope I have is that everyone in this audience has that purity. We're born with morality. We know what's right and wrong. And we just have to now start telling the truth and act on it, our own truth, because it's there. And that's the hope I have in human beings. That's the hope I have.
Thank
So
you very
I'll
much,
end with
Helen.
that. Thank you.